Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Weekly for Saturday, April 8th, 2023. Well, it's been a great week of shows with great topics, of course, great guests. We kicked off the week with a look at the home buyer wars between millennials and baby boomers. Let's take a look.
I'm seeing a lot of volatility. The Fed has continued to hike interest rates, a little bit smaller of a hike last time, but we seem to be gearing toward a pause there. So that should be good news for the mortgage market in general. But we're still seeing a lot of up and down, and that's just leading to a lot of uncertainty with buyers kind of tending to rush in and then rush out. So I'm hoping that the volatility ends soon. Yeah, and we've seen that reflected in some of the earnings reports from the home builders, which reported that they saw interest go up in January and February when the interest rates started to stabilize a little bit, maybe get a little bit lower. And then when the mortgage rates ticked back up again, then they saw a little bit of a retreat. Well, gee, as a Gen Xer, I'm a little left out of the loop, but you've got these two massive populations, right? You've got your boomers and your Gen Xers. I'm sorry, your millennials. Your millennials have been the leading home buying audience since 2014. And so the NAR profile of buyers and sellers, for the first time since then, boomers are now the biggest buyers of homes, which really surprised everyone, because we think of boomers as downsizing, as selling, and they are the biggest sellers of homes, but they are also buying a lot, partly just because they have more money. Well, I think one of the things that makes this report particularly interesting was that you're not seeing a rush to the 55 plus communities. Of the people that are eligible for that, only around 7% are opting for the 55 plus community, but more of them are opting for the multi-generational. So I think a lot of the baby boomers are starting to plan in advance and planning to have their kids move in with them or move in with their kids, and they buy the house. So I think that's some of what's happening here. Yeah, Gen Xers are still buying. We're a smaller population, so we're not buying as much. And also the other thing that's really interesting is people are staying in their homes so much longer. So the traditional thing used to be you had to stay in your house 5 to 7 years. That was the good financial planning to sort of like to get profit when you sell. Now people plan, according to this survey that came out, planning to stay 15 years. And other surveys I've seen have said people stay an average of now 10 to 12 as opposed to 5 to 7. So nobody's moving, which means that there's not a lot of inventory, which is part of why it really is the Hunger Games when you're trying to find a house. Well, part of the issue here is that a lot of times for millennials and people younger than millennials, it's a first-time purchase, right? And so first-time purchases were down. They're usually coming around 30%, down to about 26%. And so part of that is if you're the boomer, you're probably selling a house, so you've got the gains from that to put into a new house. If you're a millennial or younger, you're tapping into your savings, you're maybe selling stock, you're maybe dipping into your retirement accounts, you're trying to get money from somewhere else. So it's a much different situation, and you probably don't have the ability to get into a bidding war. You don't have much room. You're sort of at the end of how much you can spend, and so that means you're disadvantaged. That definitely is something that we're seeing more and more of. You and I have talked before about kids just staying in the house so much longer. When we were growing up, it was 18 and out the door. Now kids are coming back after college, staying in their 20s. So there is some of that incentive to get the kids maybe out of the house. But then by the time, especially now, the other thing I'm thinking about is you've got people who had kids when they were older. So by the time that the kids are kind of ready to leave the nest, parents actually may need more help. So hence maybe perhaps the need for those larger houses.
Next up, we discussed, will CD rates, that's certificates of deposit, continue to rise? Let's take a look.
This is one of the real silver linings of the Fed's rate hiking campaign. Now, of course, it's happening for an important reason, which is to fight inflation. But, a lot of these rate hikes have been negative for consumers. We're talking about much higher credit card rates, much higher mortgage rates. The silver lining is for savers. And we're seeing completely liquid, completely federally insured savings accounts over 5% now in some cases. Same thing for 1-year CDs. 5-year CDs are close. The tops out at 4.55%. But really the point here is if you are aggressive in searching for the best yields, you can actually get a really nice return on your cash deposits. That was not the case a year or two ago. That's right. Yeah. So you are locking up your money for a period of time, for better or for worse. I mean, obviously the challenge there is you can't tap it without a penalty. I mean, there is a way to get it, but you're probably going to forfeit something like 3 months or 6 months of interest in most cases. So you do want to be confident, hopefully, that you can leave the money in for the full time. The positive, though, is that if rates were to fall, you're locked in at that better rate. So that's particularly a consideration right now on a 5-year CD, because the rate crystal ball gets cloudier the further out we go. It is interesting that 1-year CDs are yielding more than 5 years right now, but that's because we think that the Fed's rate hiking campaign is nearing an end. And in fact, the market is starting to price in perhaps some rate cuts by the end of the year. Looking further out, I mean, it is certainly possible that rates will be lower 5 years from now. So that's the advantage to locking in this higher rate. You could get as much as 4.55% right now on a 5-year CD. It's all about your time horizon. If you're a retiree that has different buckets of money, that maybe there's some cash you don't need for 5 years, but you don't want to take a ton of risk, that's kind of the sweet spot here. That's right. We have a great listing at bankrate.com. So we're talking about federally insured, nationally available accounts. The top yielders are not typically household names, but that's okay. As long as there's FDIC insurance in the case of banks or NCUA insurance in the case of credit unions, you're totally protected up to $250,000 per depositor, per ownership category. So yeah, these may not be banks you've heard of. I mean, the top of the table is banks like CFG Community Bank and GTE Financial Credit Union, Colorado Federal Savings Bank, the First Internet Bank of Indiana. I mean, these are not typically household names, but they are available nationwide. They are really good places to park your money because let's face it, the big banks are not offering much at all on savings. They do a little better on CDs, but they're still not at the top of the table. It's these smaller banks that compete on rates and they don't have as much overhead. They don't have their name on the stadium. This is really how they make their mark. All of the institutions that we list at Bankrate are federally insured, either FDIC or NCUA banks and credit unions, respectively. Often the institution's website will tout this as well. You can look it up independently as well. So you could go to the FDIC's website or the NCUA's website. This obviously has been in the news recently with different bank failures like Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. So it is really important. Know those limits too. I mean, some retirees are fortunate to have more than $250,000 that they're looking to invest. That's the typical FDIC insurance, but it is per depositor, per ownership category, per institution. So you can split it up. For one, if you have a joint account with your spouse, well, then the protection doubles to $500,000. But you could put your money in different banks. You could put your money in different ownership categories. But yeah, be sure to stay within those limits. I actually saw that famous basketball player, Giannis Antetokounmpo. He was in the news recently that his financial advisor has him in something like 25 different bank accounts so that he's within those limits. Now, we don't all have as much money as he does, but make sure that you're protected.
Well, we're halfway through the best segments for the week. When we come back, we'll take a look at the other half. Everyone stay tuned right here on BRN Weekly. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms? Especially for the smaller businesses. I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is your BRN Retirement Update. A new Securities and Exchange Commission proposal may upend how retirement savers trade and save. One expert and I chatted about this.
Large majority of participants investing in their 401ks for retirement invest through intermediary platforms. And it essentially, with the hard close, essentially it turns 130 million American savers into second-class investors and favors institutional Wall Street investors over Main Street investors. Second, it makes everyday retirement plan transactions such as purchases, loans, required minimum distributions extremely difficult, if not impossible, to execute. It will undermine the open investment architecture system developed over the last 30, 40 years, potentially leaving retirement investors with fewer choices in their retirement program. And finally, ultimately what it does, Jeff, is it erodes retirement savers' confidence in the system, since transparent, timely pricing will not be widely available.
The SEC certainly has good intentions, but is it prepared to alter how retirement savers plan for their retirement futures? With your retirement update, I'm Jeffrey Snyder of the Broadcast Retirement Network.
Tax audits, tax liens, wage garnishments.
Every day we hear stories like this about good folks who are simply struggling to pay their bills. Each of them are living a frightening IRS tax nightmare, and they are afraid it will destroy their lives.
I'm a divorced single mom, and my ex-husband left me and the kids with a lot of unpaid bills, including unpaid taxes. I was really starting to show my stress on my kids because the IRS had sent me a letter demanding a huge payment from me. I couldn't afford it. So then the IRS was threatening to garnish my wages. I'm already living paycheck to paycheck. That would have put me over the edge financially.
It truly seemed hopeless, but then a friend at work told her to call the tax relief line.
The people at the tax relief line, they told me about something called innocent spouse relief. They worked it out so that all of the taxes from my ex are not my problem. I don't know how that works, and I don't care. All I care about is that I don't owe the IRS a dime, and they are not going to take my paycheck.
Even if it seems hopeless, you should call the number on your screen right now. There is absolutely no cost for the call or the consultation. You are under no obligation. If you are worried that the IRS could garnish your wages, seize your assets, even take your home, call us right now. The Tax Relief Line is here to help you. Now you have a knowledgeable, professional team of tax experts that are ready to negotiate with the IRS and fight for you to save you money. The Tax Relief Line's professionals have successfully negotiated thousands of cases, reducing and sometimes even eliminating the tax debt for their clients. It's very easy to get started. Simply call the number on your screen right now. You don't have to live in fear anymore. The call and the consultation are free.
Welcome back. Next up, we discussed whether businesses should offer paid sick leave. Let's take a look.
Well, it's a good amount. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think in terms of the United States, and I have the figure handy, 79% of civilian workers were covered by paid sick leave in March of 2022. Amongst the highest earning Americans, 94%. So in the top quartile, 94% are offered paid sick leave. But if you look down into the lower salary ranges, at the bottom quartile, only about 50% are covered by paid sick leave. Well, there is a concern that with offering access to paid sick leave, that absenteeism or absence from work will increase, that workers will stay home when they're sick, and that can lower productivity. However, we found that workers staying home sick are good for the business. We were really surprised to find things like occupational injuries had reduced when states had passed paid sick leave laws. We also found that contagion had decreased quite a bit. So you might have, somebody miss a little bit of work, but if they're not spreading it throughout the entire organization, that can reduce absences overall, which is what one of our studies had reported to. You mentioned the pandemic. Some of our studies were conducted after the pandemic or with data from the pandemic. And, the COVID-19 spread had really decreased in areas that were covered by paid sick leave or paid sick leave mandates. But even we had research that looked back to the H1N1 flu, and they saw similar results. The contagion had reduced when people were able to stay home when they were sick. In 2009, there were no states that had any kind of paid sick leave mandate. And right now, I believe Illinois will be the 15th state. I can't be certain if that one is passed or not, but it was, last I checked, 14 states and the region of DC. Since then, we've been able to really gather a lot of data regarding what those paid sick leave mandates do. So you can look at regions that had passed some kind of mandate and tease out what that does to contagion and what that does to occupational injuries. That was the shocking one for me. I really didn't think we were going to see any movement in occupational injuries, but we saw not only one study, but two studies that saw a decrease in occupational injuries. Those are really costly for organizations. So if you can reduce those, it's definitely a good thing. Absolutely. And this presenteeism is a real problem. Presenteeism is what we call people who go to work when they're sick. So it's kind of the opposite of absenteeism, where you would stay home when you're sick. But presenteeism can be a serious problem for all kinds of workers. Healthcare workers, when they had access to paid sick leave, were less likely to go to work sick, twice as likely not to go to work sick when they had access to paid sick leave. We don't want our healthcare workers to be sick. And also food service workers, retail workers, those numbers had decreased a lot too when they had access to paid sick leave. Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked, because it's a real complex variable. Our study operationalized paid sick leave as any access to paid time off. So whether it was paid sick leave, or they called it sick days, or paid time off, any access to it was treated as the variable of interest. So we saw a wide variety of 5 days versus 10 days versus a week. We also saw great variation in inclusivity. Did it include everybody at the organization or just a few? Did it include part-time or full-time? And then also there was another variable. Weaving is the researcher that looked at it in this really different way, as not just a dichotomist, was it there or not? But there was another variable that was considered. I can't recall offhand.
And finally, are donor-advised funds and other for-profit philanthropy eroding charitable giving? Let's take a look.
Sure. So for-profit philanthropy is a term that we decided to use in writing our book of that name in order to encapsulate a type of phenomenon that we're seeing over and over in the charitable giving sector, where players and practices and norms that are really native to the for-profit sector are migrating over into the philanthropic sector and being used there. And this is natural when donors, whether they're individual donors or corporate donors, see the business practices and business norms and their contacts, other players in the business world, leading them to great success in their business endeavors. They're going to want to transplant them over into their philanthropic endeavors. So it's a natural impulse. But the regulatory system that we have in place to tame the kind of inherent elitism of philanthropy doesn't really contemplate that kind of importation. It really thinks of the nonprofit and for-profit sectors as silos. And so these innovations are straining that regulatory system and making it harder for society to have kind of both insight on what's happening in philanthropy and influence on how philanthropic spending and kind of philanthropic influence gets deployed in our society.
Well, what I would say is that, first of all, I agree with everything Dana said, but I would just say that this is neither inherently good or bad. It is really just a change. I think is almost geologic in its timetable. Right, this is something that happens slowly. And a change that is overtaking the sector. And, just like any natural process, I don't think this is something that we should necessarily be worried about, but it is something that, as Dana suggested, the existing regulatory framework that dates largely to 1969 really just doesn't have the capacity to handle. So what we need to think about as a society is what philanthropy is for. Right? Why do we allow it? So if you think about why we have philanthropic foundations, why do we allow extremely rich people to put their stamp on a big pot of money and decide what happens to it? I mean, in a way, that's what we have taxation for, to make sure that a portion of the wealth that really powerful individuals earn goes back to the public. But we, for some reason, allow these extremely wealthy, powerful individuals to, just sort of stamp their own brand on it. And there must be some reason we do this. Maybe we think that they're going to provide services that government won't be able to provide for us, or maybe they'll be more generous than they would be if we are taxing it away and spending it ourselves. And when we think about why we have philanthropy, we can think about what sorts of rules we want to set as a society, as Dana suggested, to govern that. But we have to figure out why we have it in order to figure out what we want it to do and what limits we want to place on it. I don't think that, I think at its best, philanthropy, and I think of one of my favorite philanthropists, Julius Rosenwald. So he, back in the early 20th century, used his wealth, and he used it quickly and just he, in an urgent way. He built a whole series of schools in the segregated South for Black children. And this is something that the government was not doing. This is something that if we had just taxed away his fortune, these schools would not have been built. But you've never heard of the Rosenwald Foundation because its work was so urgent that he wanted all the money spent right away. So we've heard of a lot of other foundations that see themselves as more perpetual, but we don't know anything about the Rosenwald Foundation. And I think that's a real shame, because that's really, in the work that we've done, one of the institutions that I've really come to admire the most.
So foundations are pretty fully regulated, and that's actually the regulatory framework that we're alluding to, is the framework that applies to foundations. But these new innovations in a variety of ways avoid being treated as foundations. And so the way that the regulatory structure works, and we argue that this was very intentional, is instead of a kind of command and control, if you do philanthropy, you must do this, right? What happened in this 1969 legislation that Stephen alluded to is the creation of the foundation concept under federal tax law. And basically, we see it as a bargain where foundations, as kind of organized vehicles for philanthropic giving, had come into wide use among a certain cadre of very wealthy individuals starting in the beginning of the 20th century, and were extraordinarily suspect. We tell a story in the book that other scholars have related as well about how Rockefeller tried to get a charter for his Rockefeller Foundation from Congress, and they turned him down because they thought he was too powerful to run that kind of organization. He was already having enough influence, and they didn't want his potential influence to be magnified by a philanthropic foundation. So there was a huge amount of skepticism around the influence being held in these institutions. And in 1969, kind of the forces converged, and the development of this vehicle was a real compromise where the private foundation, this tax category, was created. And it's an opt-in, right? If you want to do philanthropy, you can do it as people do now in some of the structures that we describe, including using a limited liability company or through a donor advised fund or just in-house in your corporation without using a corporate foundation. You can do that. And you may even be able to get certain tax advantages for it. But the foundation form was, kind of an enticement. Please, philanthropists, come and do your philanthropy as a foundation. And if you do so, we'll give you this package of tax benefits, which at the time, when tax rates were much higher, was somewhat more of an inducement to use the form, as well as you would be able to keep perpetuity. What Stephen is describing was very much under fire, and there's right up to the end of the legislative battle over this statute, there was in the bill an idea to time limit the lifetime of foundations. That was ultimately removed as part of what we see as this bargain, and you would be able to retain total autonomy, right? And it was a way to conduct philanthropy that kind of got that skepticism to abate, right? And now we think of foundations as these, wonderful, generous, benefactors who do great things for society, kind of totally change the image of this practice, but maybe even too well, right? Because now what we're seeing is folks are avoiding the structure that foundations impose, which not only has these, two sides of the bargain, but also gives society all kinds of transparency with the disclosure obligations that foundations have. It sets up guardrails about what kinds of activities count, right, as philanthropy, not, burnishing your own business or pursuing your political preferences, as well as timing requirements, right? That there have to be kind of annual disbursements of the assets as opposed to just, saying, well, I'm creating this thing, but who knows when society will ever get the benefits, right? So all of that is encompassed in using a foundation form. And so now as folks either pull out entirely from using that form or use it selectively, society loses the ability to kind of influence how philanthropy is practiced and to have the ability to observe what's going on. So we think you need to have some new ways to get those values into philanthropy. Not that everyone's going to, use a foundation again, and that wouldn't even be a great idea, right? They're from 1969. You don't want to drive a 1969 car, right? we have a lot of improvements we could make to philanthropic regulation, but we need to get those values of transparency and timing and really targeting of philanthropy with public input back into the system.
Well, and I would just add to that, I agree with Dana. We need to figure out what the values are that are important. But as she said, the things that we cared about in 1969 are not necessarily the same things we care about today. So maybe we care about transparency, timing, and targeting, as we talk about in the book, as the values that undergirded the 1969 Act. But we may also value diversity in a way that we didn't in 1969. And we need a regulatory framework that is going to, and I keep coming back to that Rosenwald Foundation, to really embrace what that organization did. And that in a way, the 1969 Act was a reaction against. I think in 1969, there was skepticism of the civil rights work of some of the big foundations. And that's incredibly part of what motivated the 1969 Act, they were trying to curtail some of what we would be really more encouraging of today.
Well, certainly great topics, great guests. I want to thank all of our great contributors this week. And that wraps up this episode of BRN Weekly. Have a topic of interest, somebody you think we should talk to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the latest curated news and lifestyle, wellness, finance, tech, so much more and all in one place, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. Want to search our archives, check out our latest content? Well, check out our website and, of course, all of our 300 streaming partners. We're back again tomorrow for another edition of BRN Sunday. I'll be joined by members of the media, academia, financial services, and government as we analyze all the news and events for the week. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes. Now is your opportunity to co-create content around any topic on the First Lifestyle and Wellness Network. Reach a global audience through our platform and co-own exclusive branded content. All of our programs are available on demand and also as audio-only podcasts, so you can take us on the go. Broadcast Retirement Network, available anytime, anywhere, and on any device.
Are you being audited and do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Is the IRS threatening to take more of your money? Don't fight the IRS alone. The Tax Doctor is here to help you negotiate your tax bill and reduce your stress. The IRS can freeze your assets and seize your bank accounts, but you can stop these IRS actions. The Tax Doctor will work with you using our years of experience to represent your case to help you get the best resolution under the IRS guidelines. Help is here to deal with the IRS to reduce your stress. We've handled thousands of cases, so we know what we're doing. If you owe $10,000 or more in back taxes, do not call the IRS alone. Call a Tax Doctor now for a tax emergency analysis.
Call 800-224-6439.